Welcome to the door and drawer video of my laundry room cabinet. Before I start cutting these parts to length, I've already ripped them to width. Let me explain what I do so that it'll give you an idea of what you might want to do in the future, depending on the expense of the material you're cutting. To give you an idea, this long board that I have sitting on the bench, let's say, for instance, I wanted to get my door frames out of that piece of material, and I needed, let's say, 4 pieces, 20 inches long. And I go ahead and I cut that to my finished length, and then I go over to my table saw to rip it. If this piece happens to be what's called reactive lumber, and every piece can be reactive lumber, you just got to find out the hard way if it is or isn't. What reactive lumber means basically is that there's stresses going on with the interior of the board. There's grain running in different directions. Maybe the tree had a bend to it, and part of the board wants to straighten out and the other part wants to bend another way. And you start cutting into it, and the board ends up where the ends of the board will close in on one another or start to spread out. Now, if you've already cut your piece to the length you want and you find out that you've just cut into a piece of reactive lumber, you're not going to net the size that you want because it's going to have a cup in it, and you're going to have to straighten that piece out to start over again. It's not going to be the 2 inches wide that you needed. Now it's going to finish up at maybe 1 7/8. So you've just thrown away that board, or it becomes a piece of scrap to be used later on. So what I like to do is, before I cut to the finished length, I like to cut the boards that I'm going to rip to a wider length than I need. For instance, this board is approximately 4 3/4 inches wide, and I need to net 2 pieces out of this board 2 inches wide. So I'm going to throw away probably a 1/2 inch or so of material. So what I like to do is I like to cross-cut it longer than I need. And when I set up in my table saw, I don't set it up for my finished size of 2 inches. I know I've got extra width I can play with. So I turn around and I set up my saw for 2 1/4 inches. And I go ahead and I rip that. And if it turns out to be a piece of reactive lumber, I've got 1/4 inch of width that I can use to straighten the board back out by running it through my table saw or a jointer, or however I'm going to straighten that piece out again. So it's a tip that I wanted to pass on, so that if you're running expensive lumber like I'm doing right now in walnut, you hate to find out that you've cut into a piece of reactive lumber and it's the last of your lumber and you needed 2 inches wide out of it, and now you're not going to get 2 inches wide. So anyway, let me go ahead and I'll move the big long board that I just used for explanation reasons, and I'm going to go ahead and set up a positive stop on this particular board to start cutting them to the length that I need. They're already the width that I need. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set up a positive stop. I need to cut 4 pieces, 13 1/16 inch long. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up now, and I'm going to show you how easy it is. I like to throw a piece of scrap underneath my stop so that I don't end up having to deal with sawdust that's going to get in the way. The sawdust will end up underneath. Take my clamp, set it up, and make sure it's nice and tight. Boom. Now what I do is I turn around. Oops, that moved on me while I was explaining. So I will bring it back to where I need it to be, right there. That's the beauty of this particular saw. It's got a window so I can profile my cut so I can see exactly where it's going to land on the board. And that's what I'm going to need right there. So I turn around, I clamp this home, I slide out my piece of garbage, and now I'm going to end up cutting my 4 pieces to exactly 13 1/16. And that's basically how easy it is to cut a whole bunch of parts exactly the same length when you've got your saw set up for production. And even if I was cutting 1 piece at a time, that fence doesn't bother me. It doesn't cause me any grief, but it sure helps me when I want to cut a multitude of pieces the same length. And if I need to cut a longer piece, I'll show you how to run a piece behind your saw so that you can cut much longer pieces, longer than your table is long. Okay, now I need two pieces, 2 inches wide, 11 5/8, so I'm going to go ahead and clean up one end, and then I'll set up my stop to cut it to exactly 11 5/8. Okay, I can profile my blade, see exactly where I want this to be, set it up, take my clamp out, move my scrap piece back into place, throw this down, put this in, clamp it home, double check, always measure twice, cut once. And now I've got all of my parts cut for the doors, and let me show you how I lay it out getting ready to cut the groove for the slats that I use to form the panel of the door. Okay, I'm ready to mark out where the door style and rails are going to end up in the final scheme of things, so I'll show you what I do. The first thing I do is I turn around and I flush up the ends of my board with the end of my style, and whoops, so once I'm happy with it's flush, then I turn around and I make a pencil mark on the inside. I do that all the way around. Okay, so So now what I have is a pencil mark telling me where this piece is going to stop in relationship to the frame. I really don't need to do this because I'm going to run slats on here, and then I'm going to put a trim around the outside of the door. So I could cut a channel in the door all the way through and have the spline that I'm going to use to assemble the door come all the way through. And I think I might go ahead and do that to show you the way I assemble my doors. I think you're going to like it. It's simple, it's clean, and it's extremely strong. Okay, I just marked the pieces, left, right, top, and bottom. The reason that I do that is because I want to know which is going to be the face of the door. The reason for that is I'm going to run my router and cut 1/4 of an inch dado on all of the frame pieces so that I can assemble it and have a place for the slats to slide into. Now, if I don't mark the face and I just router them, and that blade is an exactly dead center of the router when I cut the groove, when I go to assemble it, I'm going to have lips on all the, raised areas and lowered areas on all the joints, and I don't want that. So what I do is I go ahead and I mark the face. So when I run the router on the face of each board. So regardless of where the dado ends up on the board, they're all going to end up being a nice flush fit when I go to assemble it. And so now I'm going to go ahead and set up the router and show you what I do. Okay, I've got my setup. I've got my router ready with a 1/4 inch slot cutter, and I've got one of the stiles, which is the upright of the door frame, clamped into position, and I'm going to go ahead and router the groove for not only the slat but also for the assembly process of the door, and that you'll see in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and run this through, and I'll show you the process that I have to go through with each piece. Now I want to remember which is my face because it's important when I go to assemble, and I don't want to have to try and guess or try and look and start measuring to figure out where the groove belongs. Now you'll notice that I ran it in the direction with the blade and then ran it the other way. The reason I do that is you won't get any chip out if you do it that way. It takes an extra pass, but you don't chip out the piece that you're trying to cut, and it's already finished the size, and I don't want to have to make another one, take a big chunk out of the board. So I run it with the direction and then against the direction of the blade, and that gives me a pretty clean cut. So now I'll get the next one going, and I do the same thing. My tape tells me this is the face, so I'm ready to go. I take my scrap piece, I move my tape so it's out of the way. I go ahead and I take my scrap piece so that I don't mar up the face of the walnut. And I clamp it home, and I run the other rail, or the other side. Okay, so I've got the two uprights, or what's called the styles cut. Now, I'm going to cut the top and bottom, or what's called rails. And I need to cut the end for my joinery and the length for my slats to fit in. So I'm going to overhang this a little bit. I'm going to move my tape down to this end. And I'm going to clamp it down here. And I'm going to run right through to the end because I don't care. There's going to be a trim piece covering the end of the spline joint, and it'll really show you how the spline joint works when I go to assemble the door. Now I've got to do the rest of it and this end, so I'll move my tape down to the other end. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this so that this is hanging off the edge so that my router bearing doesn't ride on my table, it rides on the lumber. And so let me move that down here. Make sure that it's going to trim the whole board, catch the whole board I mean. And that looks like it should, and I'm going to cheat a little more. I'm going to go a little longer. Okay, so now I do the rest of it. Okay, that's one of them. Now for the next one, same process. Let's make sure that is out of the way and that I get everything I need out of it here. have to reset it up. All right, that should do it. Move my tape again. Now, I've got all 4 pieces cut, and I will move the camera over and get ready for the frame assembly process to show you how that works. Okay, to assemble this style of door, you just watched me cut the groove for the slats to fit into, and so now what I've done is I cut these in bulk. These are the shims, or let's call them biscuits, that are going to hold the door frame together. It's my setup, and basically what I do, rather than buy biscuits, I want to use a hardwood biscuit that it really works well. And what I do is, you'll notice the grain direction of the biscuit, it's not going to split open, it's running lengthwise. So when this is glued together and assembled into the door frame, this is all going to be glued home. It's a really strong fit. So what I do basically is I'll have 2 on each end. I glue them up, but I haven't made my slats yet, so I can't assemble the door. But that's the assembly process that I go through to make a door with slats in it. So now what I have to do is I have to go ahead and I have to make the slats, and I'm going to make the slats and show you how I do that. And you'll see that process, and you can tell me what you think. Okay, I'm ready to cut the slats for my doors for my laundry room cabinet, but I wanted to tell you that this is probably not the easiest way to do it. You're cutting, your blade's going to end up, in my case, I'm going to end up needing 2-inch wide slats, so I'm going to cut a little more than 2 inches up into these boards. And I'll make 2 passes. I'll make one halfway, and then I'll raise the blade and I'll run them all through again to cut to the full 2-inch depth. I could run them all at the same time, but it's hard on me, and it's hard on the blade and everything else, because it's really making a deep cut into the piece of wood. Anyway, the other thing that I want to mention is, if you're in my position and I don't have a bandsaw and I don't have a planer, this is the way I've got to do it. And, you know, it's not the easiest way, but make sure that the boards that you're going to make your slats out of are nice and straight, because if they're bowed, you're going to have slats that are not all the same thickness, and it makes it harder to work with. So let me go ahead and I'll fire this. I'm going to fire up my dust collection, and I'll run one piece to basically show you what I do. Now, you'll notice I'm only going to make 2-inch slats, but the boards that I'm going to be using to cut them are close to 3 inches, so it's not going to come anywhere near the palm of my hand as I push this through. And so it's much safer than if I was to be cutting the boards that are 2.5 inches wide, and I'm going to cut 2 inches deep into it. These are a little bit wider, so a little more of a comfort level. I'm trying to stay out of the way of the camera, so I'm a little awkward. Okay, so let me get this into position here, and you can see that what I've done is I've cut about 1 inch into this board, and you can see the little sliver of scrap that I'm going to end up with. Now, I found a use for that, and that'll be in future videos, and I think you're going to get a kick out of it. Okay, so basically what I do is I run all of these boards that you see stacked here with this depth, and then I'm going to reset up the saw and run it to a full 2-inch depth. And I'm not going to bore you with this process. I'm just showing you how I go about making my slats. And after the slats are all cut to width, then I'm going to go ahead and put the chamfer on the edges and we'll show you that process too. I have went ahead and ripped all of the boards to a depth of the little over 2 inches that I want, and that'll give you an idea. And the reason that I make them ever so slightly wider than the finished size is so that when I butt them all together, if there's any little bends to them and it shows a gap, I can clean it up and make it nice and straight, and I'll show you what I do. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to run all of the boards that I just ripped this way. I'm going to go ahead and rip them to width so that I can turn them into my slats. And I'm going to go ahead and fire up the table saw. Now, one of the things that you're not seeing is you're not seeing me put on my ear protection or my dust collection mask, and I do that. So, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm doing it without it for the first piece, just to show you what I do without mumbling through a face mask. So that'll give you an idea what my slats look like. Now, because I'm going to be using these on a door, I need both sides to be nice and clean. This is the worst effect that I get, a little bit of a burn. That'll easily sand out. And I make the slats ever so slightly wider than I need them and thicker than I need them, so that when I sand them, both sides, the finished size will easily fit into the slot in the door frame. And here's an example. You'll see that here's my door frame, and this is a kind of a tight fit. It won't even fit in all the way. It will slide right in once I sand both sides. So that'll give you an idea of how I go ahead and make my slats. Now, after I go ahead and make them, what I'll do is I'll take the 7 slats that I need to form the door, and I'll go ahead and I'll put them all together. And in this case, this little guy here has a slight little gap in it, and that's what I'll straighten out. And then once I have my 7 slats that are going to form my door set up, then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll put the chamfer on. I don't put the chamfer on until after I've got them sized exactly, of course, because then I'll just cut into my chamfer if I reduce the size. So anyway, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and I'll rip to width all of the slats that I just made, and then I'll show you the process that I go through for cleaning them up, finishing them up, and getting them ready to go into the door. I've got all my slats cut to 2 inches wide. Now remember, one door is going to be a little bit narrower, still requiring 7 slats. I'll be cutting one of the door slats down to 1 3/4 wide each. 2 doors will stay at 2 inches. So what I've done here is I'll give you an idea of what I did. There's 7 slats in each of these little rows, and I put them together to make sure that there's no gaps between each one. In other words, there's no bend to the board. And so when they go into the door, you won't see gaps in between each slat. There'll be a nice fit. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run the ones that I need 2 inches wide through my table saw to make sure they're exactly 2 inches. These are all ever so slightly over 2 inches so that I can trim them. The other thing that I do when I make these slats, I don't make them out of the same board that I made the door frame out of. I want a contrast. I don't stain my walnut doors. I just put top coat on them. And what that does is allows the beauty of the wood to show through. And I don't want the doors completely consistent so that they're boring. I like the fact that different boards have different characteristics, especially in walnut. And so what I do is I will take a different board that has some highlights in it, some different look to it, and I'll make my slats out of that, and I'll make the door frame out of a different piece of wood so that I have that contrast. It's just a thing that I do so that, I have the look that I'm after. But this is all solid walnut, and it really doesn't matter. Walnut's beautiful no matter what it looks like. Okay, this video was getting rather long, so I'm going to cut it off here, and we'll call this part 1. Part 2 will be coming shortly. Thanks very much for watching, and if you like what you saw, I'd love a thumbs up.